Hello everybody, welcome to MS-DOSX bonus lecture number 5. This is going to be this is going to cover iCloud and with an emphasis towards the end on integrating iCloud and core data, since the two work together very, very well. Essentially, you've probably used iCloud for a ton of your applications now. But keep in mind, though, if you push an app out into the world that iCloud, it's necessary to be running Lion or 10.7.3 with a device running iOS 5 to use iCloud document syncing features. And this is just a very simple graphic, just kind of an illustration. This is more for end users, illustration of kind of a high overview of what essentially is going on with background processes and daemons that are keeping files in sync, files and data and directories in sync. So there's a number of design changes, some of them small, some of them rather large, that you need to think about when you're designing an app for iCloud usage. You can retrofit pretty easily if you've been following and using a lot of the standard Cocoa and iOS frameworks. Missing bullet. But just real briefly, and this is going to be a bit like the core data lecture. iCloud is a pretty rich framework in and of itself. So I'm just going to give you kind of an overview and give you some of the bullet points and features of it, and then there's reference material and an optional couple of labs that you can do. So first thing that you need to do right off the bat is determine whether or not iCloud is enabled and accessible on the device that you're using. And there's functionality to do that built in. You need to incorporate what are called file presenters, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about those in a second here. I'll go into more detail about that. You need to explicitly move files to iCloud. So once you have the functionality, you have to decide what you're going to put up there, what you're going to, when your app gets initialized, what you're going to store up there as default data, and how you're going to be moving data to and from those default stores to begin with. You need to be prepared to handle version conflicts, which becomes a much greater concern when you've got multiple devices and they're all synchronizing in the background asynchronously and pretty much constantly on when there's a web connection by design. So you need to be thinking about handling version conflicts right from the get-go. You need to have some way to search for your files up on iCloud storage. There's you know about metadata from Spotlight. You're using pretty much the same technologies to find and search for and index files and directories that you have stored up on iCloud, and so you'll be getting very familiar with that as well. You need to be prepared to start providing the user some additional feedback, such as the obvious ones, versioning conflicts, but also some kind of indicator to show that you're downloading or uploading data while the app is running. You need to consider using core data for live databases, for databases that can be updated on the fly. And you'll see here in a second, there's a ton of built-in functionality that you get for free if you're using iCloud and core data when it comes to synchronizing live databases. And then you need to start thinking about having more common document formats now. If you've got a document on OS 10 and you've got a document on iOS, like a GarageBand, project, you need to start thinking about having common file formats that work across both devices. It's not just limited to one device anymore. So there's some initial things that you need to do to get your project ready for use with iCloud. First thing that you need to do is do what is called enabling the entitlements. Entitlements are a way to tie your application to data that's up on iCloud and to ensure that it's your data and only you have access to it and it's secured and it's fingerprinted. And the documentation that I've linked towards the end here, as well as the tutorial for iCloud, has got a bunch of information about enabling those entitlements and installing those in your project. You'll need to go to the provisioning portal as part of this to generate an application ID. So not only do you have provisions for your applications and for each one of your devices, but you've got a provision for each individual application. We've set one up for the tutorial already. I'm going to talk some more about that when I get to the end of this and let you off on your own. But just know that that's part of the process is submitting and downloading and installing a provisioning profile on an application by application basis. You generate or you register an application ID, and that's all part of the bundle that comes with your application. Then you'll generate the profile and install it. It's become much smoother of a process with Xcode 4. It's a little more, it's a lot more automated, but there's still some gotchas. So if you're interested in using iCloud now or in the future, I highly, highly recommend that you attempt to build the application in the tutorial today, just to give you a sense of what that process is, because it is a multi-step process, and because we have to, the administrators of the iOS license have to okay your device for use with the app. So we have to be, we get notified, and if we can do that now, it'll be much simpler of a process than trying to do it by email or trying to do it later on down the road by yourself. And then you'll update the project settings that have code signing settings. You may have seen that already with iOS development. If you're installing something on the device, it's right along the same principles. One note, if you're doing iCloud development for iOS devices, iCloud functionality doesn't exist in the simulator as of this speaking and writing. So you have to debug your iOS iCloud functionality on the device itself. If you haven't done any debugging if you've done all your debugging on the simulator, I highly recommend this. Another good opportunity for you to experiment with device debugging and seeing what that's like, because it is a slightly different beast. So there's two types of main storage for iCloud data. One is simple, and that's the key value pairs. Think dictionary, think property lists. It's for small pieces of data. It's not for large chunks of data that you're generating that would be better suited for a database or for a self-contained blob. It's for settings and for synchronizing settings across multiple devices and things like that. Then there are containers, and those are the big heavy hitters. Typically you use, and I'm going to talk some more about this in a couple of slides, typically you use the NS document or the UI document superclass for it's basically a managed way that just like with core data, it's a managed way to handle a lot of to automatically handle a lot of iCloud related storage and synchronization, and those are typically for your files and your directories. So a big player in iCloud, in the iCloud frameworks, are what are called file coordinators and presenters. File coordinators, or NS file coordinator class, is responsible for managing and synchronizing multiple stores, multiple data sources within one single process. So think your app. It's also responsible for the underlying functionality of synchronizing and knowing when to synchronize and when to lock files to make sure that you don't run into overwrites and stomping over changes if two devices have made a change to an iCloud-based piece of data. And then there's also the file presenters, and the file presenters are responsible for notifying you when your data has changed, and I'll talk some more about that in the next slide or two. It's also responsible for making sure that the data remains intact and has integrity. It doesn't. You don't end up with half versions of files. You don't end up with being able to operate on data that hasn't been fully pulled down or been fully saved when you quit out of your app. So there's some user interface updates that come along with using iCloud functionality. The big three are whether or not the document that you want to work on actually exists locally on the device. You get notified, and you're able to ask iCloud, where does this piece of data actually sit right now at this point? Is it downloading? Is it sitting locally? And there's a copy up on iCloud. Does it only exist locally? Does it only exist up on iCloud? So there's some user interface considerations. If you've got a whole bunch of data that say a database, and a user wants to interact with it, they don't want to double click and then see a spinning beach ball and have no idea what's going on. You may need to let them know that it's downloading, or you can show a grayed out ghosted image, or you can show a progress meter. So those are some user interface considerations that you have to take into account. You'll also be notified when a version conflict takes place, and this includes not only when you have data changing on multiple devices and having a sync conflict, but also when if you're using a chunk of data that is from an older version of your application, you'll be notified and you'll be able to take appropriate action to present the user the option of upgrading the data or not upgrading it and not changing to a new format in case they need to use it on another device that isn't up to date with your app, the latest version of your app. And then you also want to be able to give the user the opportunity to completely disable iCloud synchronizing for your application. This is becoming more and more of a concern, a security concern. So there needs to be some way, even if iCloud is enabled and installed, you don't want to just automatically assume and start sending everything up to their iCloud account. There may also be space considerations too. So you need to be able to present the user with some kind of interface to allow them to enable or disable iCloud in general, iCloud in general for your application, as opposed to on a case-by-case or file-by-file basis. So there's some further considerations too that you need to start thinking about as well when you're using iCloud. One is which I mentioned previously, is incorporating some kind of search functionality in your application to be able to search for files. You probably will start with an initial repository and place to keep all the data in one place, but you need to also be aware that you may have users that have multiple documents and want to put them multiple places, and so you need to provide some kind of metadata that you can search for, and iCloud gives you a ton of that functionality. You also need to be able to handle cases where iCloud isn't available. If somebody has moved out of range of a hotspot on their iPad, say, and they're working with GarageBand, you still want to be able to have them be able to use their app and even save documents, and then iCloud will, in the background, once it gets reconnected, will go ahead and upload. But you still need to be cognizant of the fact that iCloud may not be available 100% all of the time, and need to handle that accordingly. You need to have some kind of interface, and I mentioned this a bit briefly a bit previous to this, but you need to have some kind of interface for specifying where a user wants to save a document, and if they even want to save it and have it sync across devices as well. You need to start thinking about dynamic naming of your documents. So if a user changes the name of a document on one machine, you want to make sure that name propagates and that you're not saving old, stale data that other devices suddenly lose track of the document just because its name has changed. You need to start thinking about also using the key value storage, persistent storage. becoming really, really popular, being able to save settings across devices. Bookmarks are a great example, web bookmarks. It's really nice to be able to just put things up on the reading list in Safari on your Mac and then hop right on your iPhone or iPad and have them just immediately available. And that's where the key value storage is the perfect place for settings and property list files. And then core data with the iCloud, which we're going to talk about in just a second, and then learning some more about the file coordinators and how the file coordinators work. It's okay to use them right off the bat, just as is, but if you're going to be doing a lot of heavy iCloud synchronization and work, you're going to want to understand a little bit more the fundamentals of the file coordinators and how they work and when they happen, especially if you're tying it to your user interface. So let's talk about using the core data framework with iCloud. So there's two primary application choices that you need to make right off the bat. And the first is what type of application it is, and the second is what kind of persistent store you want to have for your iCloud container. For the type of application, they falls into two main categories. One are the library style. Those are styles of applications that have one store, one persistent store, one core data schema, and it's open and available throughout the lifetime of your application. And this is the typical examples of this are things like music players and photos. You may be loading and saving things up on the store, but you've got one place and one store for it, and that you're going to see how that becomes important in just a slide or two here. And then there's also the document-based applications, which are things like Keynote and Numbers, where you open up a file, you modify some data, and you save it out, and then you may open up another file, modify it, save it. So you have different stores, and there's different lifetimes for those stores across your application. So you need to decide that ahead of time, and I'll tell you why that's important in just a second. And then what type of persistent store you want. There's two main types of stores. Actually, there's two types of stores. The first is the built-in SQLite or SQLite database schema. That's pretty ubiquitous, and I'll talk about what those advantages and disadvantages in just a second here. And then you've got the atomic or binary storage, which is just blob storage, and I'll talk about that in a second. You can also create your own custom storage using the NS Atomic Store class. So the advantage to having SQLite stores are that they're very, very efficient and scale really, really well. They record data on a record-by-record basis, not as one gigantic chunk every time. So it minimizes the amount of traffic and synchronization that iCloud has to do. It's stored in transactionary log format. Anybody who's taken databases or OS knows what I'm talking about. That it's not immediately stored to the database, and the database isn't immediately modified. It's stored in a transactional log, especially so that it's much more crash-proof and corruption resistant. To use the SQLite store, though, you need to specify where the log file gets stored, because they're independent from each other. The database and the log file are independent. To you, they're independent of each other. If the persistent store gets deleted, you're responsible for cleaning up and deleting that log file. So they're not intimately tied together like they would be with an atomic store. They're individual pieces. The really, really key important thing about this, though, for SQLite databases is that you don't synchronize the SQLite database. The transaction log gets synchronized. The database, you don't want that to get synchronized. You have a multi-gigabyte database, somebody changes a transaction in it, you don't want that synchronized back and forth between devices. So therefore, the database is stored in such a way that it's either local, and actually I'll talk about this in a second, it's either local or you store it in a special folder up on iCloud that flags iCloud and says, don't synchronize this folder. The Atomic Store, on the other hand, it's not as efficient, especially when it comes to larger and larger chunks of data. You get notified when that store is changed, when your persistent storage file is changed. Your application will get notifications for it. You accept or reject those changes wholesale. You just get a notification that this chunk of data has changed. And you can then do whatever you want. You can merge it or reject it or accept it and load it into memory, but that's up to you. And it's done on a wholesale basis. It's not done on a record-by-record basis. It's a lot simpler to implement, especially when it comes to if you've got a whole bunch of little chunks of data and you're going to be reading and writing blobs out. It's easier to implement, but it also makes managing conflicts a little bit more challenging. So library types of applications, these are the applications like music and photos. It's like I said, it's typically a single core data stack and a single persistent store stack and a single persistent store coordinator stack. It's recommended that you use SQLite, the SQLite persistent store for this. You provide where that store is going to go and where that log file is going to go, and then you store the database itself either locally in the application sandbox, or you put it in a folder that's got the prefix .nosync at the end of it. And that tells iCloud to skip it and not to actually synchronize the data. So you could store the database up on iCloud and not even keep a local version, but you definitely don't want that synchronizing each time that database gets updated. You can use the Atomic store for library applications. The store itself goes into a Ubiquity. You'll see Ubiquity used all over the place. It's used interchangeably within Apple as for iCloud. It's the old name for iCloud, but you'll see that Ubiquity is used in all of the method names. So your chunks will go into containers on iCloud, and then you provide NS file presenter methods for what to do when you get notified for changes and for saving and for opening files and loading files. Then for document-based applications, these are applications like GarageBand or Numbers or Pages. Typically you subclass off of NS managed document or UI managed document. You add the aggregation, the underlying fundamental aggregation and synchronization is all handled for you. That's part of the NS managed document, and the UI managed document are subclasses off of the NS document and UI document that add a whole bunch of functionality that is given to you for free. And that is just like with core data, you get a lot. You get the undo functionality, you get the reversion functionality, you get the automatic saving functionality. All of that stuff is handled for you. Plus, with iCloud, if it's iCloud enabled, it'll also do all the synchronization in the background and looking for conflicts in the background. You have to subclass this for your application and provide. It's a abstract class, and you provide some additional functionality that says, here's what my data looks like. Here's what the raw data looks like. Here's how I read and save it or load it in with the coders. And if you haven't used those yet, don't worry, you'll see those quite a bit. So you provide kind of the raw functionality for the bytes that you need, and then it takes care of all the rest of the housekeeping. Atomic stores are usually recommended in this case. It's much, much easier to load and save your chunks of data as big pieces than it is to handle all of the database transactions. You can do it. You can use the SQLite store for this, but there's a couple of limitations that you're not able to use. You'll see them in the documentation. There's a couple things that you can't do with the SQLite databases that you can do with the atomic databases. And they're also a bit more complex. Here's one of my favorite notifications. This is a notification that you get when a record has changed on the SQLite database through your NS managed document. It's NS persistent store did import ubiquitous content changes notification. That's one of them, one of a few notifications that you get. So it's a little bit more complex. So there's a list. There's excellent, as always, excellent documentation for iCloud. iCloud for developers gives you kind of an overview and a more in-depth coverage of some of the things that I talked about. The design considerations for iCloud apps talks more in depth some of the things that I covered at the beginning about things that are specific to iCloud that you need to be prepared for with your application. Here's a link to the iOS provisioning portal that you're going to need if you're going to do the tutorials today, and you'll need it later on if you're using iCloud at all. There's iCloud storage for iOS and iCloud storage for OS X. That's kind of the big heavy hitter document that's kind of the reference guide for iCloud, and then some more details about using iCloud and core data is in this last link. There's 2 labs that are available, 2 optional labs for today. There's the first one is your third iOS application tutorial that's iCloud focused. The really cool thing about this one is that it's also teaches you storyboards, which I haven't used yet, which are pretty cool. So that's a great one, and that's the one that we have set up, that we have an app ID set up for you already. And then there's also another tutorial called Preps in the Cloud, which is the key value, using the key value store. Also really helpful. Both of these are for iOS. The API is the same for both iOS and OS X for iCloud. So both of these tutorials are just as helpful for iOS and OS X. You're going to need at some point, you'll see in there at some point you're going to need to submit a request for the app provisioning profile. So I'm just letting you know that ahead of time. And I'll reiterate again, if you can do that now, that would be great, because it's not always a totally smooth road. And then, like I said, this is the third version. The lab that I have that we put up, I've got a completed project once you get to that second stage, so you can just focus on the iCloud specific stuff. But I do recommend that if you haven't used storyboards yet, that you check out the second version, and don't use the one that's up on the lab, but get to the first app is super simple and straightforward. That one takes like 10 minutes. The second one, though, introduces you to storyboard and a couple other, and will reinforce a couple of things that we've talked about over these weeks. So I recommend doing that if you haven't done it yet. And that's it. So we're gonna do. We said project proposals by this weekend, right?
Yeah, we'll have them by the end of the weekend.
Yeah. So by the end of the weekend, we'll have your project proposals back and with some notes and some possible places to look for some more info. Questions? This was also just kind of a real rough overview of using iCloud and using iCloud with core data. The tutorials are great. There's starting to be more tutorials available on the web for this as well. iCloud had a little bit of a rough patch initially, so there wasn't a whole ton of tutorials that were out there. There are more now.
Initially, everybody was just wasting their time trying to get it to work in the first place. So they didn't have time to make the tutorials.
Yeah, there are some really good ones that are available out there too. Cool.